not going to do anything more than introduce people by name and then do some opening remarks to frame their own thinking and to stimulate your questions. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined, so I'm going to get this in the right order, by Niall Dickson from NHS Confederation, Sarah Pickup from the Local Government Association, Yvonne Hignell from Bluebird Care, Max Wurr from City and County, and then far end Simon Hewitt-Davison from Independent Age. I'm going to you'll line themselves up and you'll say what I have in your list. We're going to start with just a few minutes from each of our panellists on their perspective about shaping the future of home care. We haven't pre-arranged an order, so Neil, do you want to give us an NHS perspective?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Are you able to hear me okay? Okay, fine. Thank you. I won't bother with the other mic. Let me first of all say that the NHS Confederation has launched, some of you will be aware of this, a Health for Care campaign, which is a slightly unusual bit for one bit of the public sector to be advocating on the other. And I think there are two reasons for why we thought it was important to try and bring 15-odd national organisations that are focused on the NHS together to campaign to try and change government mind around the future of social care in England. And those reasons are, first, a very basic one, that an awful lot of our members on a day-to-day basis see the human suffering that is caused by the inadequacy of our current social care dispensation. The second reason is that I think there's an absolute recognition that the future of the NHS is absolutely dependent upon its sister service working effectively going forward. And then thirdly, I think you can see a real change, I think, in mindset within. I've gone off. No, I'm back on again. I'll try this microphone. So I'll switch to this mic because this one's obviously going on and off. I think the third reason is just a growing recognition about the importance of integrating our services in ways that, frankly, has not been done before. And that integration challenge, of course, applies within the health service itself, between primary and community services and primary, community and secondary care. But it also very much applies to social care and indeed, frankly, to a whole set of wider services that are provided, public services that are provided locally through local government and through the voluntary and community sector. The days when people could sit in organisations within a local community and think, well, I'll just do my own job, I don't think those days were ever there, frankly, but we did have a tendency, and we still do have a tendency, to look within our organisational boundaries. In the health services case, there's quite a lot of looking up to the centre and less looking out to our partners and then working alongside our patients and users. And I think there's been a very dramatic change, really, I would say, over the last 5 years. I'm not saying it's a complete one, but absolutely a journey where the recognition of that interdependence is greater than ever and a genuine determination to do something. Now, I was asked just to say, and I'll say it very briefly, a few words about the political context in which we find ourselves. And I'm very conscious, having heard the really interesting session that we just come out of, and those of you who are there, around how you frame arguments and how you bring about change. The Health for Care Coalition, alongside a lot of national social care organisations, is seeking, obviously, to try and change the political narrative around social care. This is a long-standing issue, and of course there's an interesting, and there has been stuff written on this, why is social care the dog that has failed to bark politically over a very long period of time, certainly before Tony Blair's original commission Royal Commission, which sort of finished off Royal Commissions forever, just about, was really a massive attempt to try and deal with this issue, and then of course he failed to follow it through. And then since then we've had successive prime ministers, all of whom, including our current one, who claims that this will be his legacy, or one of his legacy issues. So I think there is a question of, first of all, what are we looking for? And I think we need to be very clear about that. And I think we are reasonably clear that we want, first of all, there needs to be an immediate injection, far more than has been recognised, not just for 1 year, but for a longer-term settlement, such as that has been given to the NHS, a longer-term settlement in terms of the kind of funding that's going forward. Secondly, we need to have a long-term solution for how social care will be funded going forward. And we certainly believe, and we see beginnings of signs of this, we certainly believe that some form of cross-party consensus will be required in order to do that. Not least, of course, it's quite likely we won't have a single government with a large majority. But more importantly, I think, in order to have a sustainable solution, a bit like some of the stuff that was done around pensions, we need to have that cross-party support in order to be able to do that. And I think, again, there are encouraging signs that some of the framing of people who had traditional views beforehand about how this could be solved are starting to change. So we have a degree of optimism around that. I'll stop there, but I think the challenge that we all face is very considerable. We're likely to have a general election in a very short period of time, making sure that we have a very clear message about what's required, making sure that even if it is a Brexit-dominated message, that social care really is up there and is seen as a priority across the political spectrum.
Niall, thank you very much, and I would agree with you. Just over the last few years, the number of references to social care that I hear coming from the lips of our colleagues in health has been quite remarkable and extremely encouraging.
So during the following discussion, I'll ask you to give us a little bit more about your question about what are we looking for. But thanks very much for your introduction.
Sarah Pickup from local government, please introduce yourself to our audience and give us your initial thoughts.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Sarah Pickup, I'm Deputy Chief Executive at the Local Government Association. I've got a background as a Director of Adult Social Services. I've also got a background in finance, so the money and the care comes together for me quite well. The LGA, Local Government Association, is a politically led organisation, and actually, following on from what Niall said, has reached a bit of a political consensus across party on the need to properly address the social care challenge, and they're trying to infect central government with their enthusiasm. But I don't want to focus on that today, on the political end. I want to think about the shape of what I would call care at home in the future, and that's the first point I'd like to make. We focus so much on kind of just protecting and sustaining what we've got, and just allowing to make sure we've got the right enough workforce and enough services to meet the rising needs of people, that we have less time to spend on how would we actually want it to be for us, for the people we serve, for our families. And I think if you go back to the video that was shown at the beginning about the excellent care that one care worker was providing, the words of the family, that was not just home care, it was care at home. They were doing things like going out with the individual, they were looking at memories and those kind of things, and that's more than home care. So I think the first thing is we need to sort of rethink our definition. So care at home. And I think we need to think about that in a person-centred way, and again, well illustrated in the video. And I think what we want for the future is almost the best of what we've got now, because there's some great care going on out there. There are some really dedicated care workers, there's some really good personalised care, but we are not in a situation to do that for everybody all of the time, and I think that's what our aspiration should be. And the person-centred thinking needs to be at every level. So strategically, as when councils are commissioning, they need to think about, well, what is it we can commission that will mean that people get person-centred care? For providers, you need to think about how do you train and deploy your workforce to deliver that, and also obviously it relates to what you're contracted to do, but also many of you will be providing to people who aren't contracted by the council anyway, just back to individuals. And then at individual care worker level, it's about how are you personalising that care on the ground, in that person's home, in that care home, whatever your setting is. How do you make sure that you are, dealing with that person, their needs, their wants, their I statements, rather than just the company or the council's perspective. So the way forward, I think, has to be about personalisation, and it has to be about a strengths-based approach. So enabling people to continue to use the strengths they've got, to access the things they enjoy, to continue to not be disabled by the care they get, but to be enabled by the care they get. And I don't just mean in the terms of enablement home care, which is really important. I mean in all care at home, that we are building on what people can do rather than taking over and doing it for them, because it's quicker and easier and we haven't got much time. And I know there's all sorts of things that stop that being the way we go about it, but we are talking about how we want to shape the future. All care has to be dignified, and the worst cases we've seen of abuse in care, or some of the stories we see on the periodic panorama programs, are where dignity has been left behind. And so I think that personalisation and dignity for the people in receipt of care, who may be very proud and not actually really want to have that care, but know that they need it, and to accept it needs to be delivered in an appropriate way. And I think the next point I would make is about partnership. So Niall's talked about partnership, integration between health and care. That's really important. But integration has to be about aligning care around an individual, not about services joining up their workforces. So I think we need to think about the partnership between commissioners, providers, care managers. So not all the people who work in councils are commissioners. A lot of them are care managers organising individual care, not dealing with big contracts, and that's different from commissioning. So we need to think about that. It's often left out of the conversation, I think. Also health professionals, care providers obviously, and families and individuals themselves, and volunteers, who are all part of what is it that helps someone continue to live their life in the most meaningful possible way in their own homes as their needs increase, or maybe are sustained at a particular level. I think workforce is a question we really have to think about, and increasingly we in the LGA we think, we should really do something about workforce, and we talk to UKHCA and we talk for skills for care and think, what can we do? Talk to the government, think what we can do. And I think the answer is we need to think about workforce and the market together, and we need to think about what is it we need to do by way of registration, qualification, pay, and how can we deal with that, not place by place, company by company, council by council, but what's the national attitude, what's the national approach? And the review of social care in national government needs to think about how to tackle those challenges. It's not that there's nothing you can do locally, it's just that really fundamentally shifting the way things work requires a bit of a national change in thinking and change in assumptions. And I think that in terms of the support and care that's offered through home care, care at home services, and through the companies that many of you manage and work in, it's as much about the how it's done and when it's done as what is done. So we know that, for all sorts of reasons, there tends to be a focus on the tasks that need completing, and I know that that often is to do with the way in which councils constrain their contracts, and that in turn is to do with the way their resources are constrained. I think we're better when we work together, and I think we could make better use of the resources we've got, even in our constrained times, if we thought more about the how and the when, and how we could do things differently than about the what and the precise case-by-case thing. For example, if you bundle care together in an area and say there's a set of people who need your support, like you would do in an extra care setting, can you do that in the community that gives providers more flexibility and gives people more flexibility about the care that they delivered? So personalisation, flexibility, partnership and dignity, I think all really important for the future.
Sarah, thank you very much. I was struck, you talked about a strengths-based approach in your introductory remarks there, and I was really struck by how many people in the Vox Pops that we saw in the previous film had used the word vulnerable. And I think there is going to be a big part about changing the way that we look at people who are supported with care at home in the future. We may well come back to that. Thank you very much. Our next two panellists are both social care providers, both home care providers, dealing with quite different ends of the market. We'll start with Yvonne Hignell from Bluebird Care. Yvonne, do introduce yourself and give us your opening remarks.
It's great to be here. So my name is Yvonne Hignell. I'm the MD for Bluebird Care Franchises Limited. We have 200 franchised home care businesses across the UK and a further 26 in Ireland. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our approach, our strategy, and then sort of my thoughts more broadly about the sector as a whole, or how it needs integration, probably I think, where I think that needs to be heading. So our strategy now is to help people to remain in their own homes for as long as possible, and to have the care that makes sense for them at each stage of their journey. And you know, no one wakes up one day and goes, hey, it'd be great to have a care worker coming in to help me have a bath or help me to do my shopping. Social care needs are driven through either a health issue, a disability, or through ageing predominantly. And we are part of a system. So somebody may enter an acute healthcare setting, come out of that and come back to their own home and require a social care worker. But ultimately, we are all part of a system supporting people on their kind of continuum of health or their journey through declining health or through maintaining life through disability or accident and injury. And so what's good for our business is keeping people in their own homes as long as possible and keeping them healthy and happy. And the way that we want to do that is by ensuring that we have care workers who can provide very specialist care to specific groups of people or those experiencing very specific challenges. So some examples of that are a programme around enhanced dementia care that we're developing at the moment, through use of technology and also through very intensive training for people, providing services to those individuals. And that very much is based on a holistic view of the individual, helping them to maintain their social networks, their family relationships, independence in their own home, and being able to get out and about in the communities that they know and that they feel safe in. We're also looking at the kind of latter end of somebody's journey. So we've just launched a partnership with the Gold Standards Framework to become the first domiciliary care provider, care at home provider to be recognised as GSF trained and accredited, which means that our care workers can care with confidence and competence at the end of people's lives, and that people receiving that care and their families understand that our care workers have that specialist training, knowledge, understanding, empathy. And also we can support our care workers. I mean, the lady in the video there said, you know, palliative care, being there at the end of somebody's life, and I've done it. I started life as a support worker. I know what that feels like and how powerful that can be, but also how personally challenging that can be. So making sure that we can provide our care workers with support through some of those quite challenging experiences. We're also looking to develop both here and in Ireland services specifically for people living with a learning disability, which is a bit of a new venture for Bluebird Care, but a very exciting one and one which I'm personally passionate about. And then also we're looking at living care as an extension of the services that we offer. We at Bluebird Care should never lose somebody to residential care unless that person requires intensive nursing care. So our mission is to keep everybody in their own homes with the right support for as long as possible. It's good for our business, as I say, it's good for our care workers because they get to know their customers, they get to know their families, they get to build relationships, and obviously the outcomes for individuals are so much better. Back to the broader issue about integration, we hear that word so much, and you know, I think you said it's not just about linking up the services that currently exist. We've got to turn this thing on its head, right? We've got to stop seeing, you know, the NHS has been around for 70 years, you know, social care has emerged really over the last 30 years. How can we fit all these disjointed bits together? We have literally got to start from scratch and see this is, the services are wrapped around the continuum of a person's health decline. At some point they're going to see a GP. They may then need the services of a district nurse. You know, at some point they may enter acute healthcare setting. They're then going to need care at home. We've got to leave our egos at the door and we've got to start again, truly, because I think that's the only way we're going to get over some of the hurdles that we have at the moment.
Yvonne, thank you. So starting right from scratch is one possibility. Yvonne, you're supporting people who are largely paying for their own care.
Yeah.
Max, your organisation largely supporting people who are funded by the state. What's your take on the future of home care?
It's interesting. I've been around longer than my fresh face would suggest in this sector. But,
don't kid yourself, Max.
But it's interesting and heartening to me to start seeing the conversations starting up again around this time that we were having 15 years ago, to be honest, before the economic downturn. And it's really a lot of the stuff that Sarah's been saying, about person-centered approaches to and personalisation of care. We were having those conversations in 2005, and everybody felt very much like we were starting to really make some progress and move in that direction. And then the crash happened, and the reality is that we've all been dealing with the economic impact of that for the best part of a decade. And as much as there have still been voices talking about personalisation and talking about all of these things, the reality has been that the public sector commissioners have been just trying to stretch their pennies as far as they possibly can. And the inclination has been increasingly towards simply preserving the status quo and trying to keep the price as low as possible, by and large, across the sector. There's a lot of variation, and there's have been some local authorities that have taken a longer view and have been able to invest a bit more in order to deliver better sustainability. But I think we have to, whilst being mindful of the falling into the trap of talking about a crisis, and I thought the stuff about framing was very interesting in that regard, I think we have been in a crisis, and I think also we shouldn't assume that we're not still in a crisis in terms of that funding. We don't know what the long-term funding settlement is going to be, or indeed whether there's going to be one. We can be hopeful that once we get past the current Brexit issues, that something exciting may appear over the horizon. So I don't want to necessarily frame it as a crisis. But similarly, there are also features of the market in terms of the publicly funded provision of care that are peculiar because of the way that the market is set up. It's a monopsony purchasing environment in which, by and large, the market is dictated in a local area by the public sector commissioner, usually the local authority, but the NHS or CCGs to some extent as well. Strangely enough, of course, in the middle of this period of time that we had, the decade of austerity and all of that, that's exactly when the Care Act landed. And in fact, when you read the Care Act and when you understand what the Care Act says, all of this stuff that we're talking about, really we should have been moving towards anyway. And the responsibility is on local authorities to shape local markets. But I think, certainly from what I read about the evidence that's been found over the last 5-6 years since the Care Act started to kick in, is that actually we're not seeing market shaping happening really. We're not seeing choice developing, and we're not seeing innovation really being very stimulated. There's been money put into the vanguard areas and to various projects, but still, on reading the evidence base, what I see is that the best integrated solutions for care, the ones that are really exciting, the ones that show us something really interesting about the future, are not happening in the UK. They've been happening in other places around the world. Now, there's lots of reasons why some of those models don't translate easily into the UK market. But we really do need to start embracing some of those ideas, and that does need some investment. It does need some money being put up front. It does need some trust and some strategic partnerships being developed between providers and commissioners as well, I think. We're trying to do our bit. We, City and County Healthcare Group, some people don't know who we are because we operate under a number of different brands around the country, but we are now the largest provider of home care services, of publicly funded, well, sorry, home care services full stop, I think, but publicly funded home care services certainly. And we're operating all over the UK, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, as well as in England. And so we have quite good insight into the way that commissioning is operating. And by and large, it's still being done the same. So we are trying to do our bit to push things forward. We're investing heavily in technology. We do think that technology will be a real boon, and it will deliver lots of benefits first and foremost for the people that use the services, but also in terms of cost efficiency as well. I'm not talking about, you know, robots and not yet anyway. I don't rule out any of those kind of things in the longer term, but certainly as a way of enhancing the ability of our social care workforce to do their job better. And on the workforce, just as I think my final main point, I think the workforce is a really big issue. Until we have parity of respect between the social care workforce and those in the NHS, we're really going to struggle. And I think we need to, you won't get there just by saying, well, social care is as important as healthcare and everybody should believe it. What you need to do is address some of the underpinning problems, and there are real underpinning problems. And I think we don't talk enough particularly about the issues around gender and class, and also in urban areas about race in the social care workforce. You know, why is it that the workforce in social care is not treated, held in the same regard as the NHS? Well, the NHS has the consultants and the doctors and the nurses and the professionals. The social care workforce is about as lowly regarded as any workforce can be, and it pulls from the same resource for employment as cleaners, ancillary staff, catering, you know, and there's a very, very long way to go. We can't just talk it up and expect it to work. We have to invest in it, and we have to underpin it in something meaningful in order to raise its status, and we also have to pay more for it.
Max, thank you very much. I noticed that you talked about local authorities' market shaping duty. I'm just going to queue this up for when we've done the introductions. Sarah, do you want to reply and make a comment on that once we've done the introductions? Yeah. I was just queuing that one up for you. Finally, we've got Simon Hewitt Avison. Now, Simon, from Independent Age, what's your perspective on the future shape of home care services that support people to remain at home and in their local community?
Yeah, thank you. So, for those of you who don't know, we are a UK-wide charity. We began life as the Royal United Kingdom Benevolent Association, so 150 odd years ago, but we've only really moved into the space of direct service delivery and campaigning probably in the last 5 or 6 years. So we very much see ourselves as a 150-year-old startup, so we're still learning a lot in this space. I think the two routes to impact we have are around providing service directly to older people, and also our campaigning arm of the work we do. And I think we very much as an organisation start from the person, so it's really great to hear a lot of sort of talk around personalised care, and all the work we do in the campaigning space stems from what older people are telling us directly through our national helpline. So we receive thousands and thousands of calls each year around social care, and particularly the complexity of adult social care. And I think particularly relevant to this audience is the number of people that do come to us at crisis point because the system has been too complicated, or that they're of that generation that's quite stoic and do seek help at quite a late stage. So I think one of the things that then we're campaigning for is to really try and simplify the adult social care model. So, you know, one of the big campaigns at the moment is around campaigning for free personal care, and I think, you know, we know that would have a huge impact on the number of older people that would then seek help at home and care at home. So I think, as I say, I think the link that we're doing really is just trying to translate what we're hearing on a daily basis into the sort of activity we need to be campaigning for in terms of systems change. I think the other really interesting, listening to Tamsin's session earlier, is that on one hand we're very much trying to, this age-proud movement of actually older people deserve to thrive in later life, not just simply survive. But the reality is what we're hearing is crisis. So we are trying to balance this positive aging message with the reality of what we're dealing with, which I think, you know, we would describe as a crisis. I'm now going to rethink the terminology we use, but it is a real big dilemma for us. And I think the other area for me just to mention now is actually how we improve working across the different sectors to actually, you know, support one another and actually help each other's agendas so that we do come at this as an integrated sector.
Simon, thank you. And Sarah, I said I'd ask for your comments on Max's thought about market shaping duties on local authorities in England.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think there are very few directors up and down the country who wouldn't accept that they have been they have not been able to fulfil all the aspirations of the Care Act as set out. They're quite clear about that. They say that in the ADAS budget survey, because they have not been resourced to deliver them. So, for example, the Care Act placed a duty of prevention on councils, but there was no funding to go with it. And not only has there not been extra funding, until the last couple of years where we started to make a little bit of ground up again, actually there have been reductions. So it's been really challenging. In terms of market shaping, I think it would be wrong to say that there's been none. So I think in some places there's been some good work, usually on a bit of the service in an area. So some areas might have done good work on developing micro-enterprise or personal assistance. Some areas might have done good work on high-level learning disability services to move away from care homes to kind of person-centred around the home. But there are very few places that will be able to say, oh yeah, we've absolutely shaped our market. And I think that market shaping in a way has become synonymous with, well, have we still got a market? Is it surviving? And so, you know, we spend a lot of time talking to the LGA, talking to CQC about, you know, the latest provider that might be having some challenges. Directors are dealing, you know, as they always will, there's always a turnover in providers, people coming in and out of the market, but more than ever, they're having to deal with contracts being handed back or tenders that don't deliver exactly what they want and need for all sorts of reasons. So kind of the shaping of the market at the moment is pretty, you know, in a lot of places restricted to making sure we can get the core basics of what's needed to support people, and the more innovative things we should be doing. It's not that there's none of it happening, but I think there's less of it happening than certainly the Care Act would have hoped. And I think much of that would be not in the area of, you know, what we need is more of the non-traditional things or some of the traditional things to reshape and change, but we also need some different things. A market shaping could be as much about enabling social enterprise or voluntary sector to work alongside traditional home care providers and care home providers and families, as it would be about, the strict shaping the market for home care. So I think it's broader than that, and you know, don't sit here and say, oh no, councils have done it all right, because we know they haven't been able to, but it's not that they don't aspire to.
Okay, Sarah, thank you very much. Simon.
Is that on? Yeah. Okay, just to pick up on that last point, I think some of the work that we've been doing this last year is really been talking to experts in the innovation field around ageing, and actually all the sort of major funders from the voluntary world have come back to us and investors and have said we just don't view the ageing sector as being very innovative. And so there is really an opportunity there for people to start grabbing some of this, because the opportunities are huge. It's going to take some people that are willing to take a risk and a bit of chance in terms of some longer term investments to really start stimulating this market. So I think there's a really big area there.
And Sarah?
Perhaps worth mentioning here, it's a slightly to one side, but there's this thing called the Ageing Grand Challenge. And I've just joined an advisory group on some of that. And that is, you know, it's going to be actively seeking innovative ways to invest some of their resources to do just that. And so as providers out there in the market, you want to keep an eye open for that. I mean, a lot of it's about, you know, things, but it's not all about things. It can be about services too, and new service models. So it's just something to worth keeping an eye out for.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Sarah. You've had 5 panellists giving their perspectives on the same sector. Just want to check, is anybody in the audience keen to ask a question before I move on to the next one? Raise your hand if you are, and if you're not, here's one I prepared earlier. Oh, there is somebody. And we're a microphone short.
Hello, I'm Jill Bailey. I've been long associated with the UKHCA as a provider and latterly as a consultant. I just wondered if moving into the 21st century, I'm going back to our previous speaker, if we should be changing our language of what we refer to as care. Social care doesn't attract the people. Should it not be people's care? We've got dog care. Should it not be people's care? You referred... Sheila, is it? Sorry.
Sarah.
Yeah, Sarah. Sarah, you referred to care at home. That's what it is. It is what it says on the tin. Domiciliary care, and home care has been taken over by people who provide utility services for homes. Should we not be moving into the language of the future of the people who use hashtags to communicate, and we are subject to media communication, having the power of communication?
Yeah, I mean, I think, hello? I think language is incredibly important, actually, and I don't think you can ever encapsulate in a couple of words what all of the workforce do for people living in their own homes. You know, they become advocates, they become facilitators, they become supporters, they become connectors into communities, they help people to make decisions. You know, it's so broad, you know, what our workforce delivers every single minute of every single day, or, you know, all over the UK. And but I totally get your point, and I think this is not just true for what we do, but also what we call the people that do what we do. You know, and it's incredibly important that we understand, you know, our workers are seen as unskilled manual workers. I can't think of a job that requires more of a human being than what our workers do every single day. You know, they deal with people at the very, very worst, most difficult times of their lives, you know, trying to navigate family relationships and all the emotions that, you know, old age, you know, aging and illness and disability and death bring out in human beings. And how do you capture that stuff? And how do you communicate that? And then how do you get people to want to do that stuff for £9 an hour? You know, when they can go and work at Lidl down the road and get paid £10 an hour. It's an incredible, you know, Bluebird Care, as Colin says, you know, we are predominantly private pay, so we're 80% of the care that we provide is paid for by individuals. And that does mean that we can pay more and we can invest more and we can train and we can look to innovate and we can invest in new services and technology and all of those other things. But that is not true for the majority of care that's delivered. Because most of it is funded by local authorities or state-funded means, and that results in, you know, lower hourly rates and all of that web of stuff that we're operating in at the moment. But if we can start with language, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on
Max, that. You've got some thoughts.
Yeah, I think. Hello. Yeah, I think that. Yeah, language absolutely. It's a tricky one, and language particularly in social care and in the sort of sphere in which we work is difficult to control. I'm reminded actually of, I saw a tender once for a service. I remember when we used to talk about children in care, and now we talk about looked after children. And I remember seeing an advert for a tender that came out that it was a tender to provide services to children who were in danger of becoming looked after. And I thought, yeah, okay, you wouldn't want that, would we? Or would we? I don't know. And this is the kind of knots that we can, linguistic knots we can tie ourselves up in if we try to sort of redefine terms. I mean, people will use the words that they use. I don't think domiciliary care is actually enshrined anywhere in statute anymore. It used to be, might be in Northern Ireland, but actually I think people in the sector don't talk about domiciliary care so much anymore. I think people do tend to talk about home care. I mean, obviously we're the UKHCA, and so I think that's shifting. I like care at home because it's broad and it is what it is. It's people at home being cared or receiving care, having care. So yeah, I'm quite in favour of that, and I think we do need to be mindful about the words that we use. But I do tend to think that that change comes. You know, the change. Language keeps up with what happens, and what happens keeps up with language, and it's a symbiotic relationship. It's not that one will drive the other purely. And I think until we do all the things that I was talking about earlier in terms of really investing and innovating, we're going to have trouble shifting the perceptions around the language. But I think it can be done and should be done.
Neil.
So I absolutely agree with that. I think we can spend too much time on definitions and titles and all the rest of it. But I absolutely recognise, and I think it is increasingly recognised, that for somebody who is receiving services or engaging with services, the distinction between health and social care, for example, may be very fixed in all our minds, but it certainly isn't in theirs. They don't see that distinction. And indeed, the fact that somebody with cancer is treated different from somebody with dementia is palpably nonsense in terms of the funding of that care. I also wonder, just getting onto the personalised care bit, whether and it does come back to this notion of vulnerability and dependence and so on, that and reframing language may help in this, but the approach that all of us, whatever service label you happen to come from, should be about maximising the independence of that individual. It should be about, as far as possible, handing control over, and if possible, handing over the budget and the personalised budget in order to be able to control the nature of those services. So I think the nature of what we do and how we do it has got to change. I also think that our current services, even if we get more money into them, are unsustainable unless we change the models and the approach that we go about this. And that is a big challenge for all of us across the system.
Okay, well, that's going to lead very nicely into my next question. And people I was talking to this morning will know I was fretting about not having too much time for this session, and I'm watching the clock tick down, so that wasn't a problem. But Simon, I want to just go to, you mentioned the helpline, the telephone service that you offer, and the thousands of calls you're taking from individuals. And I wanted to ask you, and then each of our other panel members, what do you think people who are considering using home-based support actually want in the future? What are we going to have to serve up to people that we'll be supporting?
Okay, so looking at this purely from the older end of the spectrum, I think with our experience, you know, what we're seeing is an increased demand for choice, for control, and the word independence there mentioned, I think. But again, I think we need to be very mindful that actually people do become vulnerable. And I think the other aspect of our helpline, we receive lots and lots of calls, safeguarding related calls around, you know, those that may be in cognitive decline. So workforce comes into it. So again, inconsistent workforce often causes distress for the people that call us. But also families themselves. You know, the majority of the abuse calls we receive are around financial abuse. So again, we need to be really mindful when giving control that actually we've got some of those safeguards in place that we can still protect those most vulnerable in society. So I do think independence, control and dignity is still what people are going to want in the future.
Great, that is a really concise summary. Sarah, your members are buying home care services both now on very constrained budgets and in the future when there'll be tons of money around, maybe. What do you think councils will be buying in the future?
I think we need something which is more holistic and is focused around, so what do people want? What would you or I want if we had a need that needed to be, we'd want to carry on as much as possible as normal, wouldn't we? So for example, if you've had a stroke and you're back home, you want to get back to maximum possible kind of way towards where you were before you had your stroke, and it's not always possible. But for some people, it's, you know, they can actually significantly improve. And if we go in and approach it in one way, they could sort of have a sustained decline. If we go in and approach it in another way, be something different. What I'd like to think is that we, I suppose, pick up the mantle that was mentioned before, really, about, you know, when I was a director of adult social services, which is now at least 6 years ago, and some years before that, we decided to go for personal budgets wholesale. And, so the idea was, who knows better what will help meet your needs than you? If I'd say to you, a week of respite care costs £1,000, and could you use that £1,000 differently to give your carer a break? I think probably a lot of people would say they could. So that choice and control and independence needs to come back. It doesn't have to be direct payments for all, but it has to be a mix of things. And I think the other thing that we desperately need is to get in upstream with our health colleagues to put in access to community-based services, to sustain access to things you already do before you get to the point of that eligibility criteria. And I think ideally I would want the councils to be spending a lot more on the services that services and support and community infrastructure that precede any need for eligible care services, in order to prevent the continuing escalation of that need for higher level services. And that will always be there, won't it? But there are certainly things we can do if we pick up people's long-term conditions earlier, if we support people to carry on engaging in their communities, if we have the community facilities there and we support people to do things they want to do, we may avoid, and things like falls prevention, handy person services, all the things that could help people sustain themselves in their own homes. So I hope we'll be commissioning different things as well as better versions of the same.
So more early intervention. Yeah. Niall, your members, your NHS colleagues are also buying services from home care providers. What do you think you're going to be buying?
Well, I think the first thing, of course, is to ask people what they want. So that will vary by individual. But actually, I think the answers back will be pretty universal, irrespective of who a commissioner is or whatever. One is keep me as well as independent as possible at home, if you can. Keep me safe and connected with the outside world. I touched on loneliness and isolation, but it's a really significant issue. Support my family carers to enable them to function as well as they can, and give them the respite that they need in order to be able to do that. And give me access to specialist support when I need it, so that you're not in a situation, which I came across a couple of weeks ago, personal capacity. It was somebody actually in an old people's home, so not a residential home, not out of your sphere, but it could have been at home, where they did not have access to pain management in a way that they should have done. Frankly, that blew a hole in absolutely every other bit of care that individual received up to the point where they died, and it was a disgrace. And the question was, people were struggling to try and do it within the residential home, but they did not have the skills to do it, and they did not have access, in spite of wanting access, to specialist help to enable them to do that.
Niall, thank you very much. As the clock ticks back to zero, we have our two provider reps. You're dealing with people who are choosing to use care at home, are receiving state-funded care. What do you think those people will be demanding from your services in the future?
So my personal view is that people want care to be accessible, so they want the routes to market. We need to really understand what our routes to market are, so that's working much more closely with health colleagues, whether that's in private or NHS settings. They want it to be seamless, so they want to go from one service to the next and not see the transition, so they don't, to your point, they don't want to think, well, I'm going from NHS now into my own home and then I've got this whole kind of convoluted, complicated process to have to go through, and they want it to be agile. They want it to evolve with their evolving needs, and to my point that we should never ever in the home care sector lose somebody to residential care, and we should be able to maintain somebody in their own home for as long as they want to be there. And so those are the three things. So accessible, seamless and agile, I would say.
Yeah, I would say. Hello, am I on? Yes. Yeah, I mean, I would echo that absolutely. I think we're at an interesting moment now demographically, because the cohort that's now moving into needing more care is the baby boomer generation. So these are people who grew up with the welfare state, they grew up as consumers, and they grow up with an expectation that they should have services that fit around them rather than having to fit around services. So I think we're going to find increasingly that service users are more vocal and their families are more vocal about what they expect. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which they will embrace technology. People in their 50s and 60s and 70s now are quite happy with WhatsApp and Facebook and social media and all that sort of thing. And I don't think we can continue to operate on the expectation that this is a generation that's not interested in embracing some of those things. I think those will all be good tools for us.
So expect customers to be far more demanding, expect them to be tech savvy, and expect a system that works together to support people at home. I can't believe how quickly that panel discussion has gone. Thank you to our 5 experts. I hope you found that informative. I certainly have, and I'd like to show our appreciation for our delegates.